It is 3 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where look, should we get the big stuff out there first? It is politically very effective to be a massive racist. Anybody in any doubt at all about that has not noticed Donald Trump, who offers pretty much nothing to the American people except permission to be vile again, permission to resurrect all of the prejudices and all of the bigotries that the civil rights movement had done and has done so much for so many years to diffuse and dilute. And it never goes away. The invitation to hate is always irresistible to some people. It's hard to pin down exactly how many. You're going to get 10 to 15% of any electorate who will prioritise racism or prioritise abuse of foreigners, abuse of expats or immigrants, or whatever word you prefer, even and up to and including refugees. That invitation will always be irresistible to a section of the population. And in the hands of a skilled operator, and I don't really know what the skills are, but you know the difference, for example, between a Nigel Farage and a Nick Griffin, in the hands of a skilled operator, it will move beyond that 10 to 15%. And then you get some insidious truths that are always ignored by proponents of this kind of prejudice, that it is, for example, a working class concern, that the working class are racist and it is important to speak up for them, which is something you will be routinely told by middle and upper class racists who are lying, because the other crucial constituent of racism is lies. It is always lies, because what you are doing is imposing a hierarchy of humanity according to completely negligible differences, according to things that do not make a difference to your value as a human being, but you must pretend that they do. In fact, one of the people on the sort of letterhead at the so-called think tank to which Suella Braverman elected to give this speech yesterday is a eugenicist, someone that tries to impose some sort of intellectual rationale upon racism, and that is something that you see happen quite a lot from people absolutely furious about being called racist while espousing racism. That's the only thing that saves us really from the abyss in this country, is that people didn't take Steve Bannon's advice and start wearing their racism proudly on their lapel. Although yesterday, the Home Secretary, herself of course a woman of colour and the child of migrants, came perilously close to doing what Steve Bannon told them to do in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, and wearing racism proudly on her lapel, because she talked about people as if there is an effective hierarchy of humanity, as if where you come from or your access to or right to everything from education to hospital treatment is in some sense determined by where you were born or where your parents were born. What's very odd about it, what's very difficult about it intellectually and emotionally, is the fact that for many people that might subscribe to her bogus notion of human hierarchy, she would be, and her parents would be considered inferior. That's the mad thing. So the critics of Suella Braverman, and I am one of them, have to argue that she is every bit as welcome here and as valid a contributor to British society as I am. That's what her critics have to argue. Her critics have to defend her from the accusations of inferiority that will be levelled at her by people to whom she seeks to appeal with this rhetoric. That's the bit I can't quite get my head around. I mean, listen, it's got nothing to do with her skin colour. It's got to do with her family history of immigration. So Dominic Raab, for example, is the son of a refugee as well, and arrived at some pretty grim opinions about how refugees should be treated. So it's not about that. It's very simply about what the people she's appealing to think of people like her family. Because if you're not imposing a hierarchy of humanity, what are you doing? And that's where the comments about multiculturalism become incomprehensible to me. Incomprehensible to me. The idea that the so-called multiculturalism, which I take to mean lots of people from different backgrounds and with different beliefs muddling along together and getting on pretty well. All of the statistical evidence is that the word that is generally used is integration is better or faster or at higher levels than it has ever been before. The idea that this woman in particular can stand up and say that multiculturalism has failed when she is a walking, talking exemplar of its success, isn't she? I mean, isn't that the point? Isn't the point that she, as the Home Secretary, the daughter, I think, of South Goan Indians who came here via Mauritius and Kenya, respectively, serves as Home Secretary in the cabinet of a Hindu Prime Minister whose parents also emigrated here from a former colony, from overseas? That to me is a fairly potent argument that she is proof that multiculturalism has succeeded. And that's where it gets mad for the Tories as well, because they point to people like Suella Braverman, quite rightly, and people like Dominic Raab, and people like Rishi Sunak, and people like James Cleverly, and people like Priti Patel. I'll stop doing that thing with my voice now. I don't want to set your car alarm off. As proof, I don't think it's a powerful argument that it proves racism is not in place, or it proves racism is in abeyance. Wherever you're from and whatever you look like, if you say things that racists like, they're going to look a little bit more kindly upon you than if you call them out for what they are. But they are walking, talking proof, surely, of the success of multiculturalism. Hugo Rifkin, the Times columnist, puts it brilliantly. It's remarkable to hear Braverman say multiculturalism has failed. She's a British Home Secretary descended from Goan Indians from Mauritius and Kenya, married to a Jewish husband in a government headed by Britain's first Hindu Prime Minister. What would successful multiculturalism look like? And Satnam Sanghera, his colleague at the Times and the author of Empireland, goes a little further. He says it was only a matter of time before one of the brown Tories vying for leadership claimed that multiculturalism has failed. This is not related to any kind of reality. It's about campaigning to be leader, making the party's mostly white, often extremely right-wing members feel like it's okay to spout this nonsense. He doesn't use the word nonsense. He is a little more Anglo-Saxon in his expressions. So those are the facts. Those are the facts. You have, and I think this is a description we will return to in the course of the morning's programme because it's powerful, right? It's resonant. A British Home Secretary descended from Goan Indians from Mauritius and Kenya, married to a Jewish husband in a government headed by Britain's first Hindu Prime Minister, himself the son of immigrants, says that multiculturalism has failed. What is she talking about? 0345 6060 973. And I don't mean that in a rhetorical way. I don't mean that in a what is she talking about in a sort of Susan Hall or Nadine Dorries kind of way. I mean that in a what is she talking about? 0345 6060 973. What does she mean? Why is she doing this? And I'm going to use that phrase because it seems to me to be absolutely pertinent to the questions that I'm asking you. A Home Secretary descended... I mean, Enoch Powell, who popped up somewhat unexpectedly in Nick's programme earlier, given that the Conservative candidate to be Mayor of London has sort of publicly demonstrated her admiration of one of the most famous British racists of the last 100 years. Enoch Powell was talking about people like Suella Braverman's parents when he gave his Rivers of Blood speech. And here she is, apparently echoing some of his thoughts. And I actually, I do this for a living, and it means you grow a weird carapace. Do you know what I mean? The microphone is in front of me. This is authentic. I talk to you from the heart every day, but it's also my job. So you slip into almost autopilot sometimes. And one of the oddest things about the job is that sometimes a story, the first reaction you have to a story is, oh, that'll be good for talking about tomorrow. You don't lose your humanity, of course, but you lose the rawness of reaction. And sometimes it's not until I hear your voice in the morning that the rawness of my reaction to a story kicks in properly. But this one kicked in immediately. This is horrible stuff. This is really horrible stuff. You can trace what Suella Braverman said in America yesterday right back to the decision by media owners and others to allow Nigel Farage into the public space and to roll out red carpets for him from the BBC down. You can trace it all back to that. And there's misogyny and homophobia in there as well. You can't offer up asylum to people who will be persecuted for their sexuality. A grand total, I think, of just over 400 people received asylum or were offered asylum in part because of the persecution they would receive. People get thrown off buildings in some countries for being gay. They get jailed, And so the racism and the misogyny and the homophobia, they go hand in hand. And it's horrible to see it in the public space at this level of government. Dawn Butler, the Labour MP, suggested to me some time ago that a white politician couldn't or wouldn't say some of the stuff that Suella Braverman says. It was a controversial comment that I'm not 100% comfortable with as a white person. I don't know that I could make that claim, make that point, because it flirts, doesn't it, with the idea that somebody's skin colour should determine what they can and can't say. And that's obviously a fairly horrible conclusion. But the baldness of yesterday's statements, which I think have more to do with the next battle to be Conservative leader than they do with anything else, they are stunning to me. Stunning and deeply, deeply saddening. Because it's a beast that can never be sated. You could, as I suspect she will call for soon, you could reduce immigration into this country to tiny numbers. And you would then turn upon people like her, you see, people whose parents came here. So you stop people coming here. That doesn't feed the appetite of that 10, 15%, that sort of what you might call that Faragist rump. There's nothing you can do to quell those hatreds because they are deep and they are ancient. They are defining for some people. It is part of their personality. Without it, they have nothing. Twitter has been a wonderful introduction for some of us to just how deep these bigotries and biases go. It's all they are. It's all they have. It's who they are. And they don't turn that off when immigration comes down to 50,000 or 20,000 or nil. It's still there. They just turn it on somebody else. And it won't always be race, which is why misogyny and homophobia always go hand in hand with these sort of outcomes. So what is she talking about? Honestly. 0345 606 0973. A British Home Secretary descended from Goan Indians from Mauritius and Kenya, married to a Jewish husband in a government headed by Britain's first Hindu Prime Minister, himself the son of immigrants, is telling you that multiculturalism has failed. Why? 0345 6060 973. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. It's a sad day, isn't it? Because you might have thought, as I did for 10 minutes, that if there was a silver lining to the Brexit vote, then it would be the fact that the racists got what they want, so maybe they'll be quiet for a while. But immigration itself is higher than it's ever been. Net immigration is higher than it's ever been. And the small boats so-called crisis continues to animate sections of the media and the political establishment. And now the Home Secretary has waded bizarrely, but quite cynically, into the heart of this this filth by giving a speech in which she suggests immigration is a threat to the West, an existential threat to the West. And she does so, of course, from the perspective of being a beneficiary of immigration from the East to the West. So what's she up to? Philip's on the Wirral. Philip, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Thanks
mate.
very much for having me on. So my wife's from a very similar background to Suella. So my wife's Goan of Goan heritage. So
Right.
mum and dad came over to the UK in the late 70s, and my wife and my brother-in-law are obviously their offspring. And now our doctors and a teacher in the UK.
Yes.
My wife grew up in Essex and experienced all sorts of racism, constantly called the P word, even though she's not even from Pakistan. She
Of
was
course.
terrible stories. And unfortunately, when my father-in-law died, even a few days after that, their door got kicked in Essex by thugs, basically racist thugs. This was only about 10 years ago.
Right.
But I met my wife at university. We fell in love. We've got 3 beautiful mixed light brown girls, which we love very much, and hopefully they will contribute towards our country in the future. And so this, for me, is purely about racism. It's appealing to that horrible fraction of, I don't know whether a political party, but that horrible fraction of our society that believes that the problem in society is not the poor sods, blaming the poor sods that come over here on dinghies because they're forced to. There's no other safe routes. They always want to blame them rather than the people in posh suits that are, getting massive PPE contracts and always creaming off the top. Suella, to me, is like, and I'll go to a film classic, which you may or may not know, James, but have you ever seen Django Unchained?
I have, yes. I have. Go on, where are you going with this?
Yeah, so the guy in Django Unchained that works with Leonardo DiCaprio, the black man, that the head of their house, basically. My wife and I were talking about this. Like, Suella, to me, and her, seems like that character. He basically made those horrible people in that film, the white people that were enslaving people, torturing people, etc., feel comfortable about being as racist as they wanted to do. He enabled it. He promoted it even in some ways. And at the end of the film, not to spoil it for anybody, but he gets his comeuppance.
I understand the point that you're making, and I think given that this is a conversation you had with your wife, who is herself of Goan heritage, it's a pertinent point to make. But 13 years her party have been in power. It's an attack upon that record as well, isn't it? It's so. I understand what you're saying about PPE. It's not either or, though, is it? I mean, I don't know that this diffuses anger directed at plutocrats. It lives in and of itself. Do you see? Do you follow what I'm saying? It's not. Why is she doing it to distract attention from plutocrats and PPE con men? She's not doing it for that reason. I know that's not what you're suggesting.
Yeah, no. It feels like it's trying to enrage the archetypal, as you mentioned on your show before, the archetypal Colin from Portsmouth that's going to get really angry. Really, this is terrible. We're being taken advantage of. We shouldn't be looking after these people. We should be looking after our own. And then, of course, when the doctors and nurses, etc., want pay rises, they're like, we don't want to give them a pay rise.
We don't want to look after our own either. I mean, yes, and around we go again. Philip, thank you. Obviously, an awful lot of people keen to contribute to this conversation, so you'll forgive me for moving on. I'd mention briefly in passing, though, that in Greece they are putting huge numbers, as of today, I think, putting huge numbers of undocumented migrants to work because of massive labour shortages, building, I think, a new airport on Crete and other infrastructure projects. So there's an alternative reading of perhaps how you cope with what Suella Braverman sees as problems. Thank you. Rakesh is in St. Leonard's. Rakesh, what would you like to say? What is she talking about?
From my point of view, good to talk to you, by the James. The way, especially in because I'm a British Asian, I've seen it in my own community with regards to how you get very sort of aspirational Indians who once they establish themselves to a point, it's almost like the ladder gets pulled up. I've even heard some of my elders talk about what it's like going back to India, and they kind of really rubbish India, and they call them freshies, basically.
Right.
So it has this really sort of derogatory way of building a hierarchy, as it were. I think. So the way she's pitching herself, it's almost like othering ourselves away from sort of Muslims or the people coming here on the boats.
Right.
So there is this kind of building and fitting into this structure, which stems from back in colonial days. So when her family managed to establish themselves in, as you said, was it Goa and then of Kenyan origin?
Yeah, I think one parent from Mauritius, one parent from Kenya, but rooted in South Goa, I think.
Yeah, so it's almost like they took on board this sort of British colonial way of doing things, and they've just carried that on. So because they're sort of like 2 or 3 generations removed now, I mean, a couple sort of built into this, I'm reading about how intergenerational trauma affects further on down the line. And if you have a look at some of the stuff that I'm reading about online, it does pass down through different ethnic backgrounds. So you've got, the Jewish, you've got the Indians, and then you've got sort of black histories as well.
Yes.
And they're all sort of affected in very different ways. And I think what she's spouting is almost like her parents' pain, and it's the same with Priti Patel as well.
Right. I mean, this is the curse of the liberal, isn't it? Is that's a sympathetic reading.
Yeah.
It makes you feel sorry for someone, even as the bile comes out of the mouth. My therapist once said to me, Rakesh, if you point a finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you, and that I don't know why that just came into my mind when you said that. No,
it does, which is exactly what I'm going through. I'm going through my own counselling as well, and I'm looking at how I'm looking at a way. I'm looking at my. It's difficult to describe. I'm looking at my parents in a way which is sympathetic rather than blaming them, because you just think, how far does this go back? So they were brought up in such a way where they didn't really have a way to articulate what was going on. So it's just now that we've found, through various research in mental health, how we can sort of pinpoint these traumas. And I think also
It's beautifully put.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
It's something that I've been really kind of processing.
Well, clearly you're living it. That's why you speak with such authenticity, I think. So what does she mean when she says multiculturalism has failed?
I think she's highlighting because it's almost like a brownwashing. So she's appealing to the Indians. So when she says about multiculturalism has failed, I think it's just the othering.
Yeah.
Or either that, or I just think on the flip side, she's diluting this racial message. Because, like you said, how can your traditional racist, if that's even a term, how can they continue their message when you've got someone brown saying that to them?
And actually, in many ways, that highlights what you're articulating about your personal journey as well. In that it's very hard for many people to understand how somebody who would be attacked by precisely the kind of characters that she's seeking to appeal to can end up doing what they're doing. But it speaks to intergenerational trauma and all sorts of other emotional and intellectual contradictions. It's a fascinating area of study and one into which I've barely dipped my toe. But thank you for the guidance, actually, Rakesh. 10:30 is the time. Lottie Morley is here now with your headlines. 10:34 is the time. Nikki is in Kent and she writes, I think you might have forgotten what show you're writing into here, Nikki, because you begin by saying, sorry, I have to bring Brexit into this discussion. Nobody has to apologise for bringing Brexit into any discussion on this show. It will be the defining political issue of at least 2 or 3 generations in this country. But it is as if, writes Nikki, the Conservative politicians have to keep the hate up towards expats or immigrants in order to keep their Brexit lies alive, the lies about the foreigners in their midst and people that voted leave and think it's the permission to applaud this rancid racist language. Well, but I still want to understand what it means. When she says multiculturalism has failed, despite being, by most measures, an exemplar of how it hasn't failed at all. It's 10:35. Kevin is in Islington. What is she talking about, Kevin?
I do not know what to say, James. She's an immigrant that I am, and she is now do not like other immigrants.
Her parents came here. She was Suella Braverman herself was born here.
Oh, absolutely not. But she's the daughter of an immigrant,
Yes.
and there's a mathematical rule that A is equal to B and B is equal to C, and therefore A is equal to C. So let me just prove it to you in that way.
Okay, carry on.
She is actually an immigrant. I'll tell you this, James. I actually came 19 years ago to this country,
Yes.
and I'm not a doctor. I actually work with NHS.
Okay.
I'm a consultant. I work somewhere in sort of southwest London, but I live in Islington. And I contributed this country completely. And just to let you know, I have one radiologist and one gynecologist. They came to this country by boat. And, you know, one went to Oxford, the other went to LSE, where you actually went as well, quite frankly. And they are actually contributing this country one way or the other. When I listened to this woman last night, I was always under the impression that, you know, she was basically the Attorney General of England and Wales.
Yeah.
And she's a clever woman, and, you know, she would be far better than Priti Patel and whatnot as well. She's well educated. But when I was actually listening to her last night, I actually laughed for at least 30 minutes. That how can that be possible that one immigrant who made it here, you know, she's the daughter of an immigrant, she's completely immigrant, like Rishi Sunak. And then they say, well, actually, close the door and no other immigrants. If I wouldn't have to come to this country, James, I would have never ended up in Imperial College. I would have never become a doctor as well.
What?
This country gave me those opportunities.
And you know, and that is, it puts people who are critics of Suella Braverman in the bizarre position of defending her right to be her, really, which she seems to believe she or at least her 21st century equivalent shouldn't have the rights that she and her parents enjoyed. So when she says multiculturalism has failed, what does she really mean?
Well, she is actually the product of multiculturalism.
Well, that's what I would say, but that can't be. So what does she? Yes, but what does she mean? Because she
didn't mean anything.
Right.
She's a busy fool because she's basically fooling her own self. When you're the production of multiculturalism, now you are basically complaining of that multiculturalism. You are anti-immigrant. Well, if the immigration rules were that tight as the way it is now, your parents would have never come to this country. You would have never been into university and become sort of the Attorney General of this country, and then now a Home Secretary of this country.
She also studied in Paris. She also studied in Paris, so you know there's a proper sort of cosmopolitanism in her background that she seems to find repellent when other people.
It doesn't make any sense.
It must make sense. I'm going to stop you there. It must make some sense because she knows what she's doing, I think, and other people. We might use the phrase dog whistle, although I don't think this is a dog whistle. I think this is a perfectly audible whistle. So she is appealing to a section of the society, a section that is disproportionately represented in the Conservative Party membership, as we know, and yet somehow trying to inflame these ideas and these prejudices while simultaneously excusing herself from the hatred that she fosters. It's bizarre. That's the bit I don't get. She says multiculturalism has failed. Does she mean there are too many women in headscarves walking around, for example?
That is the thing, James. And you know, if you want to stop the immigration and you want to reduce the immigration to this country, the way I see it, that I think we need to stop wars outside of the United Kingdom and sending forces to other places as well. It will stop automatically. I mean, I lived here for the last 19 years, and I've never ever seen any Syrian in this country until the war started, and who basically supported all of it. I mean, I'm from the part of the world where people love you, basically, and I do not want to say it, and there would be lots of controversy around you as well. But just to let you know, there's a guy called Imran Khan. He actually loves you, and you know he even talked about you a few days ago before he went into jail. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, who married to Imran Khan and whatnot, is Jemima Khan and whatnot as well. You are very famous there, though, by the way, and I think they want you to go there and just join the PTV there, the Pakistan Television Network. You will be doing extremely well, James. You are, just to let you know this. So what basically?
Well, this took an unexpected turn, didn't it? Enough about me.
You're the hero. You're the hero in that country, and you're also the hero in India as well. By the way, just to let you know.
Yes, we shall see.
Just to let you know this, James.
But that is what she's talking about. She's talking about there are two. I mean, you know, you can insert whichever bit of society, whichever bit of the diaspora, whichever beneficiaries of immigration you personally don't like, she is telling you that you're right not to like them and there's too many of them here. But she obviously doesn't account for the people who would include her in that category.
That's correct. If the NHS doesn't work, we will have to stop, obviously, complaining and blaming immigration that it's because of the immigration. If let's say the TfL doesn't work, we will actually, blaming someone else. It's so easy to blame someone else.
It is, and Nigel Farage genuinely did. I stumbled across it while researching my new book. I genuinely did blame traffic jams on immigration, and it didn't exactly curtail his rise through the ranks of British media and politics. Kevin, thank you. I crikey, covered a heck of a lot of ground, but from the perspective as well as someone who is proof that multiculturalism works. Without multiculturalism, what sort of state would the NHS be in? Unless when someone like Suella Braverman uses the word multiculturalism, she means something different from what Kevin and I hear or what you hear. She means something different, and I suspect that the idea that there are too many people here, too many women walking around in headscarves, not including nuns and the late Queen, but too many Muslim women walking around in headscarves is what Suella Braverman is talking about, despite those numbers being completely negligible as well. And speaking of negligible numbers, I think the figure is 451 in 2022, which are the last available figures. Net migration now running at about 600,000. I don't know how many asylum applications were processed in 2022, but I can tell you that 451 people cited their sexuality as a source of potential persecution back in a home country. So that's 451 people in a country with a population of nearly 70 million, or 451 people against a backdrop of net immigration the following year in excess of 600,000. And for reasons that only Suella Braverman can know for sure, she felt that yesterday was a good day to talk about not letting sexuality be a grounds for seeking asylum. And the Daily Mail have dug out a lawyer today to write about it, and the article oddly makes no mention of numbers. It's weird, that, isn't it? How big a problem is this idea of... So let us accept that some asylum seekers may lie about their sexuality as a reason for being granted asylum. So they would be persecuted in their home country for being gay, but they're going to pretend to be gay because they want to move here for different reasons. So let's imagine that some people do that. So out of 451 people who were examined, if you like, whose cases were examined and processed, how many did the authorities fail to spot were lying, and how many were telling the truth? So even among those 451, you're looking at a small minority of the 451, and yet that apparently is a big enough problem for the Home Secretary to speak about. It's really ugly, right? Joe's in Camden. Joe, what would you like to say?
Hi there, how you doing? I think maybe over-intellectualising it a bit too much. I think it's just pure racism, and she's up to the right of her party because I think she's going for the leadership role. I think there's an I'm mixed race, just to say I'm mixed race. And what I believe is that what you find is and I surround myself with black and Asian and white people all my life. I grew up in a predominantly white area. But what you tend to find as an adult is once someone gets elevated to a certain position, they always associate greatness or whiteness with success. And what they want to do is distance themselves from their origins, where they came from. And what I find, because I look Asian, but I'm mixed race, I tend to get treated slightly differently when an Asian person speaks to me than rather a white person speaks to me. Okay. And I probably was called a coconut growing up, which I wasn't actually. I just adapted to the society. Yes. But I find that a good way of thinking about this is, goodness gracious me, I don't know if you remember that clip of the two couples not wanting to be Pakistani, but associating themselves with the golf club. I remember that clip. And it seems to be that once you elevate to a certain point, I think we want to distance ourselves from things that allow us to accept where we come from. I think that tends to happen. And I find that in the Asian communities, and I have these conversations all the time, and there is I'm okay to be Asian when I go to a wedding or go to the mosque or the Hindu temple, but when I'm successful, I predominantly want to be white. If you're a middle class, a certain point of success. So I believe she's out and out racism, and I think it's her leadership ambitions.
And that's a calculation.
And I think we're intellectualising it.
Well, I don't know that we are. I balk at that accusation, but I balk at most accusations. So it doesn't mean it's not valid. But it doesn't answer the question of what does she mean. And your answer could be quite simple to this question. But when she says multiculturalism has failed, what does she really mean?
Simple answer. Women in burqas, people on boats. She's appealing to a certain extreme right of the party, and she's doing that for political
very
reasons.
deliberately and very
When she talks
transparently, and off the back of 13 years of power. So it's an attack upon the record of the government in which she holds one of the highest offices.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Agreed.
How bizarre. Thank you, Joe. Taking us right up to 10:45. But before we go to the junction, I have some grim news to share with you. Officers have made an arrest after a teenage girl was stabbed and sadly died in Croydon this morning. Chief Superintendent Andy Britton, who's in charge of local policing, said our immediate thoughts are with this young girl's family, who are facing the most tragic of news. Our officers are with the girl's family to support them. Acting on information provided to them, officers also worked closely with colleagues from across the Met and the British Transport Police to track a teenager in connection with the stabbing. I can confirm, said Chief Superintendent Andy Britton, that an arrest was made at about 9:45 this morning in the Croydon area. At this early stage, we believe that he may have known her. So that's very, very sad news from Croydon in the last hour. The time now is 10:46. It is 10:49 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I see Sangeeta has put together a collection of senior Conservatives as evidence of how absurd it is to suggest that multiculturalism has failed, starting, of course, with the Prime Minister, but also at the current or recent cabinets. You've got Kemi Badenoch, Sajid Javid, you've got Suella Braverman herself, Kwasi Kwarteng, Priti Patel, Nadeem Zahawi. I guess there is a case for arguing that this doesn't prove that multiculturalism has succeeded, because if you are a Conservative politician arguing that there is too much immigration, then you're not arguing from the point of view of multiculturalism, are you? You're sort of arguing for monoculturalism, but with the hope/belief that you are exempt from any unpleasantnesses that may be unleashed. I don't know. It's a weird one. I find it emotionally and intellectually confusing sometimes, but I don't believe that skin colour, and all of those politicians, of course, are members of ethnic minorities. I kind of don't believe that just because you've got brown skin or black skin, you're not allowed to be a racist. I think that that's a bit white saviour. I've fallen into this trap a couple of times myself in the past, and it's quite. Mehdi Hassan's tweeted something overnight that speaks to that possibility, and of course, I'm not sure I would or could do that as a white man, and that is as it should be, because I don't have the history of trauma, I don't have the shared experience of racism in the way that a person of colour would. But you don't. It's lazy, I think, and patronising to think that anybody who's not got white skin must be either compelled or expected to subscribe to the same values. It's as daft as thinking everybody who has got white skin must therefore subscribe to the same values. So it's tricky. The word assimilation is not the same as the word integration, for example, and neither mean the same as multiculturalism. But we're still not 100% clear on what Suella Braverman means to imply when she says that multiculturalism has failed. 10:52 is the time. Paul is in Southampton. Paul, what would you like to say?
Thank you for having me on your show.
You're very welcome.
I'm just really disappointed. I mean, I've been involved in politics for over 40 years, and at local government, and I was the mayor of Boston when we went through Brexit.
Oh, crikey.
And so I can tell you how bad it was there.
Yes.
And I'm now in Southampton because I wanted to live in a multicultural town near the grandchildren.
Yes.
All I'd just say is interesting. You've got to look at why she's doing this. And I also remember, being a Brummie, I was around when the Rivers of Blood speech.
Yeah.
You know, and I have to say, what she's saying is very similar. If you read that speech and read what she's doing now, she's really challenging what kind of people we want into this country. And I think the point that you raised about whether she's from, brown skin or whatever, yes, I don't think that's irrelevant. I think you're right. I think it's a mindset. And, you've got to look over the last 12 years, since David Cameron and what he did, and with Theresa May when she sent the vans around London, and then since then with all the women who are in the Home Office there. Yes. And there's a mindset in there. When they fail on immigration, and they are failing with it, because they don't know how to deal with it, the best thing to do is just attack it. And they actually think, and I actually believe, that she's challenging for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And also, you've got to also think this week, I think she's trying to take a bit of steam off the Prime Minister anyway with the train issue. And, she's
I don't know about the second bit, but I think the first bit definitely holds true. Because Liz Truss did this as well, but using nonsense about trade deals that were rubbish and pretending they were brilliant. So you've got, in this case, possibly 1.5 eyes on the Conservative Party membership, and you can rely, because of your status, so the Home Secretary gives a speech that we would probably rather ignore, but we can't because she's the Home Secretary, so it's national news. But, you've touched on the politics of it, Paul, which is actually bonkers, because it's an attack upon the party that's been in charge for the last 13 years.
Let's be clear, normally, when you're involved in politics, you are community leaders. Community leaders lead communities.
Yes.
The way that what she's doing is not leading a community. She's actually trying to fragment a community.
Well, that's a very good point.
How can she make a job to be, the Home Secretary and potentially, the Prime Minister of this country if she can't lead our country?
So it's divide and rule. It's divide and rule in the simplest sense then. And the other thing it does, which I hadn't thought of until you put it like that, is, and we may talk about this later in the week, is that it sends a really unpleasant message to people living here, that the Home Secretary thinks that had a hierarchy of humanity been in place last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you wouldn't be here. You are not the sort of person that we want here. And that's where the emotional and intellectual confusion kicks in, because under that reading, she wouldn't be here either.
No, and sadly to say, the people, what kind of makes me ashamed is people in her own party.
Yes.
Allow her to make these statements, and they don't condemn it. And
some did actually. I think some have, but of course it's not going to be reported in the Mail, is it, or in much of the Murdoch media.
All I can say is the only thing that's got to happen, James, is that we need a general election, and hopefully the British public see through this nonsense and these bad vibes that you do. The other thing that...
but they don't see through it if you throw up enough of this. This is where the Trump parallels kick in, isn't it? Because the intoxicating nature of race hate is so complete that you'll forgive absolutely anything. Indeed, that's what he meant when he said you can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue.
And also, James, the figures nationally on hate crime are going up anyway.
Well, it's hardly surprising, is it? With her doing this, it'll be lawyers next that come under attack.
It will. Unfortunately, we live in a very sad society where the people who want to lead us want to create division in our society. It's not the kind of country that I think we want.
I think you're right. And it would be quite nice to see the opposition or an opposition party making these points in rather stronger terms instead of tiptoeing around the issues as Keir Starmer does. And there it is. Thank you, Paul, because it is very deliberate and it is very divisive. And in fact, Suella Braverman is the one that is driving division through our society by saying you're allowed to look at that person over there and think that they have less right to an education or a hospital bed, or they've got less right to it than you have. That is what she is telling people. And yet, again, we struggle with the notion that the people who want to believe that message would include her in the critique. Paul, lovely stuff. Thank you. I'd love to talk to you again about your experiences as mayor of Boston during Brexit. That must have been a bit of a ride, as they say. 10:57 is the time. Bridget is in Camden. Bridget, what would you like to say?
Yes. Good morning, James. Hello. I come at this from a sort of psychological perspective.
Yes.
Because there's a kind of illness that was defined by, I won't get too detailed, but it was discovered by Melanie Klein, who's well known historically.
Okay.
And it's called projective identification.
Right.
Or projection.
Yes.
And I'm touching a bit on Jo, a previous speaker.
Yeah.
Because she's doing something very strange. And so is Richie Sunak, because both their families came over to England in the 60s.
Yes.
She was from, I think she was from...
one parent from Mauritius, another from Kenya.
That's right. And it's a very strange thing. They've kind of externalized their discomfort, I think, about their own heritage and projected it onto what they call the small boats.
Yes.
And it's actually a very intractable problem to treat, which is why I think, I won't go into Rishi's position, he's a kind of enabler, I think.
Right.
But it would be very difficult to help her. It would take years and years of therapy to kind of unravel this.
What it is that is going on inside
That's
her,
right.
really.
And I do agree with this, other people's sort of idea that it's political, but it's not. I find it when I watch her, I find it that coming from quite a profound place.
That's a great word. So what you're telling, it goes deeper than ambition.
Yes.
This is not opportunism. So. This is psychological.
And I don't think she can help it.
No, I don't think she can either.
I think it's out of control.
Well, you see it, it bubbles over sometimes when she dreams of Daily Telegraph front pages, deporting but bona fide asylum seekers, actual, because the applications aren't processed until you get to Rwanda, and then they pass, and they stay in Rwanda. She dreams about that. That's sick.
It's very sinister, that.
It is, isn't it?
Very. She worries me. I mean, I'm from Canada. I don't know if you picked up my accent, but England welcomed me, and I was entitled to come here. I had no problems here. But England is a very welcoming country.
Well, I'd like to think so, certainly compared to other European countries as well. We're a paragon of multiculturalism, and yet we have beneficiaries of it insisting that it's failed. And I think, actually, when I put it like that, beneficiaries of it insisting that it's failed, then you're talk of psychology and profundity, a sort of profound basis for this dissonance, actually becomes irresistible. Because my language is simple and your language is more academic, but you're absolutely right. It is profound, and it is deeply, deeply strange. And the curse of the liberal once again. And I don't say this glibly. I mean, it is the idea that people are fundamentally good. And when people end up doing terrible things, it's often because of something that has happened to them. And that makes me feel sorry for Suella Braverman, which is, I mean, not a particularly helpful or interesting perspective, but I would argue that it's close to inevitable the more work you do on understanding how she could end up in the place where she's ended up. Bridget, thank you. The time is 1 minute after 11. It is 4 minutes after 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to go in a slightly unexpected direction next, because it's a topic that is actually really important, but which, and indeed is newsworthy, but it is I'm not as immediately provocative or inflammatory as Suella Braverman's latest rantings. I'm talking about two issues, really. One is the what of it, and the other is the why of it. Children are missing school on an unprecedented scale, and the reasons for it are unlikely to be addressed by the policies in place to fix it. Mental health difficulties are on the rise on incredible levels. This generation of children that also endured distance learning, endured lockdowns and school closures, will have been impacted in ways that we are not going to fully understand for a while, if ever fully understand. We're coming to an understanding. Some research this week shows that middle-class children, wealthier children with parents more likely to still be together, suffered the most from distance learning. And I think part of the reasoning behind that is that I guess the more you've got to lose. So the more used you are to functionality and comfort, security, and a rich, if you like, social life, a rich inner and outer life, then the more you will suffer when those things are taken away. I think that must be part of it. Otherwise, you tell me why you think that middle-class children suffered more from the privations of distance learning than children from less privileged backgrounds. Can we dig that out, actually? Because I forgot to talk to you about that at the time. But it speaks very much to today's subject, which is essentially about the rocketing numbers of people who are young people who are not going to school, particularly among older children. And one of the reasons given, and there will be several reasons, one of the reasons given is a a softening of resolve, if you like, as a consequence of lockdown. I get this, actually. I didn't really think about it until it happened, until I read this research, until I saw this story. But the softening of normality, is that the right word? A sort of renormalization. You no longer felt every morning, I've got to get the kids to school, right? This is among parents. I'm interested in the motivations of the children and indeed of the parents. So you've got what is described as persistent absence now has more than doubled since before the pandemic. That is roughly defined as a pupil missing 10% or more of sessions. So persistent absence has more than doubled since the pandemic. Now, some of this, I think, will be anxiety and fear. I don't think you can underestimate how terrifying change can be, particularly for young people who spent a significant part of their formative years in a state of isolation. But I think that the parent angle is fascinating to me as well. You're unlikely to ring me, aren't you, and say, yeah, I don't really care whether my kid goes to school or not, James. But I would like you to, if you do recognise elements of your own experience in what I'm saying now. But I think that actually makes sense. I think that the first thing you think of when you get up in the morning is getting the kids to school, right? Depending on their age, but at key points in their education, making sure they're on their way to school, or sometimes if that's the way the cookie crumbles in your house, you're taking them to school, making sure they're out of bed, making sure they're not going to be late for school. It was the other way around in my house when I was growing up. I was so flipping weird about being late for school. I think they were quite nasty punishments when I was a day boy. I was late for school. I'd be shouting up the stairs to my dad to tell him to get out of bed and come quickly because we're going to be late. But usually it's the other way round, I think, in families. It's the parent doing the hectoring and the harrying to get the children to school. And that becomes such a crucial part of, I don't know what you'd call it, the family furniture, the familial furniture, right? That you never ever question it. You never ever question it. And then the pandemic ends, or at least the distance learning ends, and the schools reopen. The children go back to school. But something inside you has stayed the same. Somewhere inside you, that sense of urgency about getting the children to school has been diluted. Has it? Or even destroyed. It is no longer, we're fine, if I say nobody died, I'm not making light of the pandemic. You know that. But in the context of your specific family, their kids didn't go to school for the best part of a year and nobody died. What's the panic? You don't want to go, I can't be bothered. Also, I had a producer, my first ever producer, was fascinated with this subject. And I didn't really understand why. If you go to boarding school, what we once called truant and what we now call persistent absence, or even school refusal. If you go to boarding school, it's not really a thing. I mean, we did try to skip lessons sometimes, and you might fake a sick note or you might tell a lie. But actual, not going to school when you live at school is almost impossible to achieve. There was one morning when I somehow managed to lie in a made bed so flat that the prefects thought I'd got up and gone to school. But, of course, when I didn't turn up for lessons, phone calls are made and explanations are demanded. So you can't really play truant at a boarding school. So when I first started working here, my producer at the time, who went to a comprehensive school in Hanwell in West London, the same one that Mo Farah went to, actually, for fans of trivia and possible future pub quizzes. He was absolutely, he used to get very animated about the idea of parents being responsible for getting their children to school. Because by the time you reach the sixth form, you're physically quite formidable, right? I mean, imagine, for example, and to use an extreme as an illustration, a single mother, a slightly built single mother, trying to get a 17-year-old prop forward out of bed and to school when he doesn't want to go. What chance has she got? I'm not going to school, Mum, and there's nothing you can do about it. What chance has she got? Seriously. She can't physically. I mean, even if she was built like Jeff Capes, she wouldn't really be physically able to. What are you going to do? If a teenager is lying in bed and refuses point blank to go to school, for whatever reason, what the hell can the mum do about it? What can the dad do about it? I would say not very much at all. So the second bit of this story is the absurdity of fining parents when children don't go to school. It's quite Victorian, isn't it? So you've got mental health difficulties, which mean your child can't go to school. I'd like you to talk to me about that. 0345 606 0973. I know, for example, that the likelihood of you getting help from CAMHS is pretty much zero. A slight trigger warning now for talk of suicide, but many CAMHS departments in many councils up and down the country will not activate until an attempt is made by a young person. Even ideation is not enough for a referral to CAMHS. So criminally and chronically understaffed and unfunded have they become since David Cameron introduced austerity in 2010, that the likelihood of getting there is minimal, frankly, except in the most hideous of circumstances, and even then still hard. So that's a massive part of this story, is how on earth can it be right to punish a parent whose child is too ill to go to school? You know, if the child had 2 broken legs and needed to spend time off school as a consequence, no one would complain about that. But if it's a mental health issue that's keeping a child off school, then parents can still be punished for it. It's a last resort. MPs on the Commons Education Committee calling now for these fines to be kept as a last resort. But even if it's not a mental health issue that is compelling a child to stay in bed or not to go to school, even if it is, and I can speak from the imagining of my own youth, even if it is because you're stubborn and lazy and you're refusing to get out of bed because you don't want to go to school, because school's really boring, frankly, and I want to play FIFA. Well, my mates aren't going, so why should I? What can that parent do? Seriously. And if you know what teenagers are like, and it doesn't stay like this forever, thankfully, but you say, look, if you don't go to school, I'm going to get fined. A teenager, the response of a teenager that involves a rolling of eyes and, I don't care, that is not rare. I don't know what happens during adolescence, but it's as if sometimes the spark doesn't cross from one plug to the other. Your beautiful little baby who was utterly lovely until their 13th birthday becomes for 3 or 4 years a sort of grunting monosyllabic sludge. I don't care. Hasn't happened to us, thankfully. Seems to be slightly more a male thing, but it happens to girls as well. So what are you going to do? I'm not going to school. Well, I'm going to get fined. I don't care. You can afford it. I can't actually afford it. Well, then they can't fine you then, can they? I haven't got the money to pay the fine. Well, then you can't pay the fine then, can you? Next question. I mean, there's a reason why the Kevin and Perry characters that Harry Enfield and Kathy Burke did are so brilliantly timeless, isn't there? Because everyone is familiar with that model of adolescence. But what can you do? What can you do? So those are your 2 main reasons for persistent absence. Mental health issues, where you're almost certainly not getting the help, or just sort of dysfunctional relationship, a breakdown in parent-child relations, which means the child is just refusing to go to school. How is fining the parent ever the right answer? Never mind simply as the last resort, which I suppose you've got to take as progress from the Commons Education Committee. But how is it ever the right response to say, I'm going to fine the parents because the child won't go to school? It's weird, isn't it? The more you think about it, the weirder it looks as a policy. And yet at first glance, certainly if you're dealing with knee-jerk tabloid sensibilities, it would be an attractive policy. Oh, yes, absolutely, punish the parents. And by the way, if you can't afford to have children, then don't have children or something. But the more you think about it, in fact, don't we find this with almost every example of really lazy, bloated right-wing rhetoric? This actually just giving it 5 minutes of critical thinking and it falls apart like a cheap suit. How can punishing parents when children aren't going to school solve anything? Except for that small number of persistently absent children who are perfectly capable of going to school and will do so if they are fearful of their parents getting fined or of punishments being inflicted on them. I'm taking away your PlayStation if you don't go to school. It's a funny one, isn't it? So talk to me about it. Why? Our post-pandemic, I'm particularly interested in post-pandemic, why would the number of persistent absence have doubled? And ideally, we'll come at it from both angles, the perspective of the parent and the perspective of the child. And possibly the perspective of teachers as well. So what is it about the post-pandemic period in particular? Almost sounds like a tongue twister, that, doesn't it? The post-pandemic period in particular. She sells seashells on the seashore. What is it about the post-pandemic period in particular that propels persistent absence to previously unscaled heights? 0345 6060 973. It is 20 minutes after 11. Matt says middle-class parents were more likely to have jobs they could do from home, meaning the children weren't made to go into school, as poorer families would likely have jobs that they had to go into work for during the lockdown. It's a good point, Matt, but the comparison is made between children who were distance learning. So the children from affluent backgrounds who were distance learning received or suffered the steepest decline in mental health during the pandemic, a more steep decline than children who were also distance learning but were from less affluent backgrounds. But that would definitely be part of it. More likely to have parents working from home while trying to juggle childcare. But I don't know. The highly educated, here it is, those youngsters whose parents were employed, stayed together and were highly educated appear to have suffered sharper falls in mental health than those who were less well off. So, I think you've probably got part of the answer there, Matt, actually. The question of why the post-pandemic period has seen a huge spike in persistent absence is the one that we'll address a little more directly. 22 minutes after 11 is the time. Paula is in Stoke-on-Trent. Paula, what would you like to say?
Hi there, yeah.
Hello.
So I started a different job throughout lockdown, and that was moving from working in a school to working with an agency that tutors children who are either school refusers or they've been thrown out of school.
Okay.
So I work one-to-one with them, either in their home or in a public place like a library or museum or somewhere like that.
Yes.
So it's really opened my eyes, as to why some of these children are not in education. So I thought I'd just give you a call
Please.
there and just
Absolutely. Excellent.
Yeah, so,
you're right in the middle of it, really, aren't you?
I am, yeah, and it's heartbreaking. Some of it is heartbreaking. So majority of these children who I see who are not in education, it isn't the parents' fault. It really isn't.
No.
The parents are pulling their hair out and really worried for the future of their children. And for them, for their GCSEs, their exams, everything, the social skills, the parents are really, really worried. And when I start to work with them, majority of these cases, within the first or second session of working with them, I look at them and I'm working with them and go, this child's autistic. This child's got ADHD.
Right.
This child's dyslexic. And then you start to gain the trust of this child because they don't have any trust. They've lost trust. They've lost trust in the system.
Right.
And you start to work with them and you say to them, what was it like in school? Well, I read in your report, that you used to throw chairs and swear at the teacher and run out and hit people and stuff like this. Why were you doing that? And a lot of them is because they didn't understand the work. They didn't understand the work, and there's nobody there to help them. And then the next thing, they're moving on to the next part of the lesson, and they've not understood it. And so every time when they're going back to that classroom, it's like, well, I don't understand it anyway, so I may as well get kicked out. Then they'll put them into isolation, and they won't have to do any work there. They are given some work, but there's nobody really on their back to make them do the work. And and some of these kids, it's different situations. Every single child I work with, they're different. But a lot of them, I've found, is that they are so anxious in the classrooms, they can't conform. And when you're in school, you have to conform. And if you don't conform, they'll make you do something else to conform.
Yes.
So you'll get punished for something else. So, okay, so you're not conforming there, so we're going to make you do that, and you need to conform there. So you're not conforming there, so we'll punish you again. And you need to conform there. And these kids, their anxiety,
goes through the roof. And then during distance learning, presumably they calmed down a lot.
They did. So a lot of these children, I've noticed that when you speak to them, well, how was school before lockdown?
Yeah.
And we notice in a lot of these kids that I'm working with, lockdown happened as they moved from primary school to secondary school.
Yeah.
And that's a huge jump.
Yeah.
That's a huge jump to go from primary to secondary. And they got to secondary and it's a whole new ball game. You know, you're not mothered as much as what you are in primary school. You know, you're spoken to differently.
Yes, of course.
There's hundreds of people in your year, you know, and everything, and the anxiety levels. And then lockdown happened. So they went home. They're learning from home. And they're thinking, well, I enjoy this. I'm comfortable. I'm happy. I feel better. And then when they had to go back to school, the anxiety levels rise again. And now they've got to a teenage years where they know, I'm not going. I'm refusing. I am not doing this anymore. They kick off. They get thrown out. They get sent home for 3 days a week. They get put on reduced schedules. It's that.
I mean, you're describing it quite brilliantly, but it's bleak, isn't it? Because under your analysis, it all makes perfect sense. Of course things have got worse. Of course things are bad. And of course they've got worse. The system's entirely unfit for purpose. And I presume, Paula, and I hope you'll allow me to say, I have a feeling that you're brilliant at your new job.
Oh, thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. But I presume there are not nearly enough Paulas in the system to make as much change as we would, to make as much progress as we would like to see. They're
not. My day goes from driving from one home to the other, to the other, to the other. Sometimes I can be doing 70 miles just in one day, just going between different pupils. But I absolutely love this job. And as soon as these children start to trust me and see that I'm there for you, I've got your back, and I will teach you at whatever level you're at, I will meet it.
Yeah.
And as soon as they start to progress, the confidence. I've had parents crying to me because they're so happy.
I bet you have. And parents in those situations would take any baby step as a huge improvement, because it is a huge improvement. Do we need to change our mindset as a country then? And so the children that you work with, we don't see your job as being to get them back into school.
No.
We need to educate them. We need to educate them somewhere else.
Yeah, they're not going back, some of these kids. They need different provisions. The job that I do is a one-to-one. There's not many of them.
No,
and the agency is saying, have you got any more hours? Can you fit any more kids in?
Yeah.
Because Stoke-on-Trent at the moment has got loads of kids out of education.
Everywhere has.
And there's still loads. And sometimes you'll turn up to see a parent and they'll say, my child hasn't been in school for over 2 years.
Do you find the work more satisfying and rewarding than your last job?
Oh, without a doubt.
I thought you might.
It is brilliant. There's nobody back. I do have paperwork,
yes, of
but
course.
I go at the child's pace. And for me, it's like, look, if the child isn't going to get his GCSEs, it doesn't matter. It's okay. But in the meantime, this child's gained confidence in somebody from education, and they've gained confidence in themselves. They've started to progress. They've started to learn.
Must be amazing.
And there's functional skills qualifications that they can do.
Rather than trying to hammer square pegs into round holes, it's just a waste of everybody's time.
Options.
Of course.
There's options.
Wow. I mean, occasionally I take a call. I think, and you were first, weren't you, on this topic? And I think, well, we've done it now. We don't need to talk to anyone else. That's it. So it's only 11:30. I've got, I'm here till 1. But and obviously I'm joking. There'll be lots of other wonderful contributions and different perspectives and different experiences. But that combination there of undiagnosed conditions rendering children in school unschoolable. And then the lessons of pandemic. So how big a role would masking have played? So prior to the pandemic, these children, they would have tried, even though they didn't understand. Got it. And then pandemic kind of took the distance learning kind of took the lid off masking, really, and people became their true selves.
It's this age group that we're all looking at, isn't it? If you look back, it's this age group right now who are due to do GCSEs last year, this year, the next year. It's that age group that we're having problems with right now. You've got to look at that bridge.